Without further ado, here's Wyeth. He is an art director at Epic Games, Inc. He's a lifelong gamer who started his career in graphic design, made the transition to video games 12 years ago, and never looked back. He's worked on some of the biggest game franchises in the business, including Gears of War, Star Trek, Counter-Strike, and more. Wyeth will be talking to us about what it's like to make video games, what it's like to grow and motivate an art team, how to be a creative member of an organization and communicate with leaders, how to watch for the decisive moment between managers and artists, and what public access television has to do with all of it. So please help me in joining and welcoming.
Hi. One thing I like to do when I'm interviewing people for a job is I ask them, tell me 3 things about yourself that have absolutely no relevance to the conversation we're about to have. And people can interpret that however they may. And so I decided to do the same thing for you guys because you don't know me at all. I love to eat. I travel specifically for the purpose of eating, as you can clearly tell. I like to bake and cook and make things, and sometimes I artfully arrange them into photographs and take pictures of them and post them on social media. I don't really know why I do that, other than for my own edification. I'm an amateur street photographer, so I like to wander around downtown Raleigh and look for juxtapositions of form and shape and color and just try to kind of inform my eye that way. Just want to make sure you guys are awake. Everybody good? Coffee? There's still some in the back, I'm sure. Counterculture, stop making so delicious. Crumb, why are you so good? I used to be a graphic designer, and that's kind of how I got into professional art, making money doing it. And I had these grand dreams of changing the world through design, in that avenue. At the end of the day, I ended up looking like this 98.3% of the time, being sad across from somebody to client meeting, iterating for 6,000th time on a business card or whatever. Turned out it just wasn't the job for me. And so I found my way into this. And it's pretty amazing that I get to do that, 40 hours a week. Monsters and explosions and guns and heroes saving the world. It's a real honor. It's very cool. So I'm an art director at Epic Games. We're out in Cary. I've been making games professionally for about 12 years, and like I said before that, making art professionally for an additional couple. I've seen both sides of this industry, the bottom and the top, so to speak. I specifically remember one project that I worked on where we were working 80, 90-hour weeks for like 9 months. And I would curl up under my desk at night, 2, 3 in the morning with a blanket, and I would fall asleep, and then I would wake up in the morning to one of the owners in the company, and he'd drop an Egg McMuffin on my chest. And he would say, all right, let's do it again, that loop. And then a week after the game came out, reasonably critically acclaimed, the publisher had a dispute with the person who owned the IP. They stopped making copies. They printed 100,000 and stopped. And so that, incredible effort that got put in, we couldn't even make our money back, let alone reap any benefits. So it's a roller coaster industry. But I've also been on the other side, right? I've been involved in these amazing, big blockbuster style projects as well. Like our most recent release, Gears of War 3, was the culmination of a $1 billion trilogy. $1 billion in sales, 20-some million copies sold. An incredible project to be involved in. But ultimately, what this talk is about is not really making games, it's more about creative leadership. And I'll get there eventually, so I'm just going to bounce around a little bit. My name's Wyeth. I was actually named after N.C. Wyeth, who's a famous illustrator. He's the paterfamilias actually of an amazing family of artists. If you're not familiar, go research it. My parents had to kind of be hippies in order to name their son Wyeth. They're both, artists in their own right. My mom's classically trained watercolorist, studied under a guy named Robert N. Blair, who's in the College and Display, and many other places. And my dad is kind of a polymath, I guess you would say. He's just kind of good at everything, and was always kind of leading me to the next, interesting inspiration and problem. But he's creative in his own different way. They're the kind of parents that didn't give me a middle name on purpose, just so that if I didn't like my name when I turned 18, I could pick my own. But that was kind of cool. That's me as a kid, right? That's the definition. There's a juice box, there's like a little bowl of cereal. That's me 24 hours a day. And these formative years are actually the root of my creative leadership today. And that's kind of is what comes full circle that I'm going to talk about. So if you picture on one side, my mom's on one side infusing this kind of creativity and this kind of like a sense of aesthetic. And on the other side, leaning in is my dad, who's like, let's go fiddle with a 2-stroke 1970 German moped, just like really interesting contrasts there. And those things balance out to kind of create who I am. There are a couple of experiences that have stuck with me from this formative era in my life. And I'm going to talk about 2. And both of them have roots in creativity and in leadership. And this is the first one. So I was about 8 years old probably, and my parents gave me one of those puzzle books. And it's just it's like one of those brain teaser things where you can flip through and there's, logic riddles and puzzles and math issues and stuff. And then the final page, it's 8.5 by 11 book or whatever. And the entirety of the page is taken up with 9 dots. And in the corner, tiny little thing, it says, draw 4 straight, contiguous connected lines through all the dots. And so I'm like, okay, yeah, I got this, right? And so rather than ruin the puzzle, I got tracing paper and I put it down. And so I start to go and I'm like, okay, so what if I do it that? No, did I miss 2? Down, okay, clockwise, right? And so I start flipping through and trying, and I'm discarding the tracing paper, and I'm doing my thing. I'm like, well, okay, continue to try. Can I abandon all law of logic and reason? No, that doesn't work either. That's an actual photograph of me at 8 years old, angry at the puzzle. My dad sees that I'm struggling with it. And what's actually fabulous about this, I haven't asked him this question, but I will ask him this question someday, is that looking back, I realized that I think he actually went through the book and did every puzzle in the book before he gave it to me. So that if I struggled with it, he knew what to do. Like that's I'm going to ask him that question. I'm pretty sure that's true. And so he got the tracing paper and laid it down. We were both sitting on the floor. And he draws a line. And it just runs all the way off onto the hardwood. Fabulous moment in my life. Second line, runs off the page onto the floor, third line. And there's this thing about breaking the boundaries of the puzzle that was revolutionary to my 8-year-old brain. There just was never a puzzle or something that put me through the motions that forced me to rethink what I thought was true about how you solve a problem. It's kind of interesting, fascinating moment. So of course I'm like, noted. Okay, so the puzzle, remember that moment, remember the description of what I went through. I want to put a pin in that idea for a second. That's what I refer to as the man. So just remember that. Push pin. Okay. Another thing. You saw the picture of me as a kid, and I'm there, I'm playing video games, but when I wasn't that version of me, I was this version of me. Those were the 2 versions of Wyeth that existed in the universe, and in fact there was no other versions. Those are the 2, that was my binary choice. It was video games and books. And super early I got taught how to read by my dad and my mom. Both of them drew picture books for me so they could learn words from their hand, which is pretty cool. I still have those books, they're amazing. What my dad noticed was that I was putting my whole mind into the act of reading. Like I was absorbed in the world, even when I was really, really little. And so he pulled me aside one day, and he pulled out the New York Times, which he would read every morning. And they took an X-Acto knife, and he cut exactly one line, one column out. And it turns out he used the New York Times because it always has a predictable column width. He didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time he wanted to practice. So he cut this thing out, and then he said, okay, glance at it, look away. And so I would, and I didn't get anything. He's like, that's fine, we moved it down one, glance at it, look away. Like 10 series of that in, I'm already like, whoa, I just saw the first half of that whole sentence, right? Our brains are phenomenally amazing at doing problems like this. We just never let them because we don't exercise it. But think about driving down the highway and glancing at street signs and stuff. You guys know what every single one of those signs says, and you're not registered. You're not actually reading it, right? Our brains are amazing at it. And so, I got good at that, started to kind of grok the line, and then he cut a second in. And that's where the whole revolution happens, right? Where he's like, all right, and this didn't all happen in one day, right? We would do this exercise randomly over the course of my youth. But I would say probably over 2 months or something, a month. And so we get to the 2 line, and he's like, okay, glance, look away. And you would not believe it, but with just the simplest glance, our brains are entirely capable of reading everything that's there. And the next progression of that, by the way, is you take the page away, and you just start to kind of, you just move, and you can go with your finger. This represents kind of like where my finger would be landing, even though you don't have to use your digits. And by just kind of moving down the page in a rhythm, you can speed read. And your brain will just knit everything there together into a real thing that you're comprehending. It's incredible what our brains are capable of. So as a kid, I'm like, what? Mind blown, this is amazing, right? And I'm like, the result was, I'm like known as the kid who will take the manual out of the car while we're on a road trip. And I'm like reading about a 1989 Subaru GL wagon, and like, oh yeah, I know how to do the all-wheel drive. Of course I know that because I've read the manual 83 times. I read the cereal box and the milk carton in front of me as I'm scarfing down my cereal so I can go play a video game or read another book. Revolutionary moment, right? So, great. Put a pin in that idea, right? I'm calling that one the plan. So we got the man and the plan. Put a pin in those. Remember him, I'll get back. So, that's what I get to do all day. It's so freaking cool, I can't even comprehend it. Making games is phenomenally difficult nowadays. It takes huge teams, and the people that it takes have, the talent that you have to acquire is mind-blowing. For a scene like this, you've got environment artists building 3D worlds and environments, and they're applying lights, and they're putting atmospherics and volumetrics into space, and they're doing textures and shaders that they're applying to the world, and character artists that are building these incredibly high resolution, three-dimensional versions of these characters, and animators who take those and they bring them to life and do animations and mocap. Particle effects artists who are creating all these magic spells and using parameters to control how it all works. It's a phenomenally hard problem to do this now. And when it comes to Epic, we think we got it licked pretty well. And we've been around and successful over 20 years. The average game company lasts like 5 or less. They just don't stick around generally. Our Unreal Engine technology, which we build in-house, we use to make our own games, and we also, hundreds of other game companies have used our technology to create their own games. And it's the dominant force in the entire game industry in the realm of game technology. Our first foray into the mobile gaming space on iOS and other resulted in Infinity Blade, which is one of the most critically acclaimed and highly lauded franchises on that platform, amazingly successful. And it's so good, and Apple likes it so much that we've shared their keynote with them multiple times to show off their new devices. Incredible honor that few people get. And our franchise Gears of War that I was referring to earlier, like I said, that's a $1 billion enterprise that is beloved, and we still to this day have hundreds of fans who send us images like this. That they care, and they're so connected with what we're doing so much that they indelibly mark their body. And that's not just the one crazy awesome guy who decided to do that. He's one of hundreds. We've got hundreds of pictures of fans who send us an email and say, check out what I did. And we think, yeah, you did. In fact, you did, good sir. Well played. That's an amazing honor. And what that's about is a quality bar, right? That we bring to all of the stuff. All the things are brought in the quality bar. And thinking about it, there's no special sauce to this necessarily, other than we hoard talent, like aggressively and greedily. The median industry tenure at Epic is like over 9 years, which is massive for this fledgling industry. It's unbelievably experienced compared to your average studio. We try to keep our hierarchy as flat as possible, as little management as possible. And man, there's nothing more important than hiring. Nothing is more important. There's this fantastic book by a guy named Jim Collins, you guys probably know it, called Good to Great. And one of the core tenets of that book is get the right people on the bus, and then you figure out where the bus is going. Just get the right people in, you guys will go somewhere fantastic, right? And that we absolutely adhere to that philosophy, and every creative organization benefits from that philosophy. And to show you how seriously we take it, from application to acceptance, Harvard University, 5.9% of people who apply get into Harvard. If you want to look at the CIA, from application all the way through the whole process to admittance, that's about 2%. At Epic, we have 0.07% acceptance. So it's 3 times easier to work at the CIA than it is to we don't mess around when it comes to getting the right people on the bus. And there's no special sauce, but when you work with and manage really, really talented people, there are a couple of problems. There's plenty of problems. We all know there's infinite problems. But the two that I want to talk about revolve around uncertainty. And that's actually the core thing I'm talking about today. And I call those 2 problems the man and the plan. Those are the pins that we put in earlier. So, the first one is a phrase that I hear a lot, which is, or at least if not a phrase, an idea, which is the, how dare you put creativity in a box, right? The perception of creative pursuit is that freedom über alles, right? Which is less schedule, less bounds on the problem, less, driving me towards something. Let me run free, right? No, that's not actually how it works. It turns out the box is exactly how you mate the creative enterprise to something that ships and gets put on a shelf, right? The bounds on problems are what help define and allow creative people to eradicate uncertainty and get to the business of being creative. Let me give you a real world example. So this is a piece of conceptual art from our game, Pierce War 3, painted by a fantastic conceptual artist at Epic named Shane Pierce. And this is the kind of art that we would do in the beginning of a project when we're trying to feel out and figure out what is this game? What is this world that we live in? And it's very loose, it's gestural, it's just about mood, and it's just trying to indicate how's the player supposed to feel in here, you know? And the instinct is to, or at least was for us at one time, was to actually just give this to an environment artist, which would be the person whose job it is to translate this into reality, into 3 dimensions. And there's a bounded aspect to that problem, which is, like, you look at this thing here, it's a fountain, right? It looks like a water fountain. It's in there, it's got shape, it's kind of reflected, and it looks like there's some water coming out of it. Okay, we need that. The journey from this loose idea of fountain to that, where every component of this has to be thought out, everything in here is deliberate, is a monumentally difficult creative exercise. And so remap the entirety of this scene to that problem, and without bounds, it becomes almost impossible to not only schedule, but just finish. Right? The scope isn't there. It's like saying, here's a room, make it whatever you want, furnish it. Oh, it's also the size of a football field, and you have no budget. And you're like, I don't know. Okay. And contrast that with this, which is like, here's this cozy nook, and it's all pretty much there, and it's lit, and it's already got the sense of aesthetic, and there's a direction to it, and you grok it, you get it, what this is. Oh, and go and, you know what, we're going to take this post picture down, I want you to replace that with your own thing. Right? Think about the difference between those 2 problems when you have to apply something creative to that, right? give yourself a box to think outside of. And the way this mates back to what I was talking about before is this puzzle. And what I learned about it is not that it's the cliche think outside the box, right? That's like the first place you go when you think of the puzzle. It's like, no, you gotta think outside. There's literally a box, think outside it. What I realized is the interesting part of that is the freaking piece of paper. That's the interesting part of this conversation. If I had the same piece of paper and I've got those 9 dots there, and they're tiny and they're in the middle of this big unbounded thing, I don't have to make as much of a creative, logical leap to get past the bounds of the problem and actually do something creative, i.e. truly do think outside the box by going out of the bounds. It was only because it was a properly bounded puzzle and it filled the page and it was where it was supposed to be that I had to make a mental leap to get outside of it, right? And that's the value of that conversation. And the most important thing is that you put bounds on problems and it benefits a creative leader because it's easier to schedule things. It's easier to manage where things fit and how they go. It's easier to understand the ramifications of like waterfall stuff, that things happen here and then it daisy chains down. And then if you're a creative worker, if you're just self-managing or you don't have a leader with you, it's a digestible way to break up problems, to set really, really good bounds on subsets of this whole big issue. When it's digestible like that, the success is right there in front of you. It's so much easier to relax and be more creative. And the way I summarize it is this phrase, which is creative leaders stand in the chasm between uncertainty and the needs of a project, putting a path of boxes down for designers and artists. I really believe that's true. And guys, creative people will always do something unexpected with the box. You never have to worry that you're boxing in too much. Just find good bounds for problems and let people go. They're going to do something fantastic. Right? So that's thought one. Now the other pin that we pushed in, plan. Right? There's this idea of what's next on my list. I want that to raise ire, that question. I want that to raise your kind of hackles and send off your radar. Because that's a red flag question to me, because I think that question, just the inherentness of it, is rooted in uncertainty. There's a uncertainty that generates this question that is the responsibility of creative leaders to eradicate from an organization. So I'll use my handy little pie graph here to demonstrate. Let's consider this the unbounded creative potential of a given designer. There's some subset of that which is life, right? I'm worried about the tire on my car. I had a fight with my girlfriend. I've got to call my mom tomorrow. That's just a sunk cost that's going to eat up a certain amount of creativity out of any given design person. There's also a non-trivial fraction which is, in my opinion, universal. I've never met artists or creative people or designers that don't have it, which is massive doubt, fear, and self-loathing. Universal constant, sunk cost, right? Everybody always assumes they're doing exactly the wrong thing and they have no idea what. That's okay, yeah, and it does grow and shrink, for sure. But I'm just giving it a reasonable assignment. And then there's another wedge which is specific to creative people, which is, like, I introduced this as a pie chart, and like I'm thinking about pie now. Like there's just like a risk that comes with like flighty creative people that like that's just some cost. Okay, so there's some wedge of the unbounded creativity of people to be creative, right? However, the rest of that chart is, in my opinion, eroded almost exclusively by uncertainty. And being more or less certain about the state of the union for a creative person defines how much of the rest of that they can tap into. So we'll tie that into the exercise before. When my dad came in, and I'm there tiny and reading and loving it, he had two options at that point. Option one was, have a book. I gave you one, you liked it, have another book. That's a fantastic option. I hope everybody takes that when they have little kids around. But the interesting thing that he did was he went here. And what ended up happening is that by me learning how to speed read and read all the things I kind of joked about. What happened was that I owned the act of reading, which is so different. I identified as a reader, right? It became part of the things, like the problem set that I took on. Like, yeah, I read now. That's a really empowering thing versus I have a book. And so if you look at it in an abstract way, it's thinking about it like a rule rather than a goal, right? And so the rule is I identify with reading and I accept all of the ramifications that come along with identifying as someone who reads versus I read a book. And if you think about rules rather than goals, that is an uncertainty eradicator. It takes uncertainty out of the equation. In a more design-specific conversation, maybe an example would be make it blue, right? You've got some project, you've got some abstract task, make it blue. That would be a goal, which is, yep, it needs to be more blue, right? And that's a thing that we've heard as designers and artists. The other side of that would be, okay, we need this to recede, and cool colors cause things to recede, warm colors cause things to advance forward. We need it to make people less hungry because we're painting a foyer or whatever, and so cool colors suppress appetite. There's color theory ramifications to the conversation, which the end goal of that conversation is, oh yeah, I intuitively know because I know those rules that thing should be blue. It's blue now. And so now as a designer, I self-identify as somebody who knows how to fix those types of things, right? And as creative leaders, we have to continue to infuse those rules on people we work with rather than just say, make it more blue. That's a worthless conversation. It gets somebody nowhere other than, great, I had a task and I executed the task and I did it wrong, right? Creative leaders create owners, not individual solutions. Okay, I'm creeping up on time here, but I do want to say one other thing, which is this concept of the decisive moment. So I mentioned in the beginning that I'm into street photography, and the grandfather of modern street photography is a guy named Henri Cartier-Bresson, and he has this fantastic quote, which is, to me, photography is the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event as well as of a precise organization of forms which give that event its proper expression. In my opinion, what he's kind of saying is you have to know what to look for, and then you have to have the right information that allows you to take advantage of it at the right moment. And I think that this idea, if you take the abstraction out and remove photography, has really, really great relevance to what it means for creative leaders and creative people to work together. So there's a period in time where as a leader, there's a line which is the trust that people have in you as somebody who can manage and lead. And over time, making good calls and good decisions and being a good director and listening, doing all the things that good leaders do, that line of trust is doing this and growing. And then the other side are the variables of the project, which is the uncertainty line, right? Which is, maybe I'm uncertain about my place in the company, maybe I just don't know what to do next, maybe there's some bigger overall problem about my career growth or something, but there's uncertainty ebbs and flows. And the higher the trust is, or the more advanced it is, the less far this line has to go before they bump into each other. But when they meet, when they bump, that's the decisive moment. And that's the moment when, and creative leaders should be like watching for this. There's like no more important thing than like, okay, is this happening around me right now with anyone that I'm managing? Which is, there's gonna be a point where somebody steps out of their comfort zone, they trust you enough, and they're aware enough that they're uncertain that they ask you for help, right? And it's only by having the conversation about uncertainty, talking about it just like you would schedule or direction or any of the other things. You have to talk about uncertainty and how more or less certain people are about their problems in order to actually make people even know that it's a thing that they need to have on their radar, right? But when those lines intersect, That's that moment. And in my opinion, my personal opinion, there's no more important thing. How creative leaders respond to a request for help is the most decisive aspect of their relationship with the people they lead. It's probably good. Do that. Thanks for listening.